I was thinking, I was like, it would be way too clunky of an intro to be like, this is the every SMRPG in SMRPG, but here I am saying it anyway. Yeah, this is the Every FNFF podcast. We're doing a little bonus episode. We're kind of between seasons right now. If you're just kind of joining us, we finished up our coverage of Final Fantasy 13, and next we're going to be doing everyone's favorite Final Fantasy game, of course, Final Fantasy 2. Not to be confused with Final Fantasy IV, that was then localized to be 2 and all that fun stuff. But today is March 10th, and I don't know if this is a strictly like North American kind of thing, given the way that we do dates here. But today is Mario Day, and
in England, because they put the dates backwards, it's actually Yomar.
I love that you say England put the dates backwards when North America
we're the ones
is the only ones who deviate from the rest of the world, like
That's
like
right.
the metric system and all that.
So I've had this idea for a while because March 10th is Mario Day, but I'd come across my radar that Square Enix, as we know, has touched some Nintendo properties in the history, and I think this one we're about to talk about is the beginning of that. But they've also done, they apparently developed some basketball games that feature both Mario characters and cactuars and stuff like that. Which, but Mario Day lands on a Friday this year, so we had to do this one.
Yeah,
but none of us, I would say, are the expert on
anything
ye olden JRPG development. So we have in fact brought in a guest to help us through this through these muddy waters of ye old Square properties. And that would be, guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Aidan Moher. I really like Final Fantasy, and I'm a little surprised. This is a Final Fantasy podcast about every Final Fantasy. I played them all front to back this weekend, every one. And we're talking about a different game? I am unprepared.
Oh, shit.
Well, that's the question. What constitutes a Final Fantasy, and is having Final Fantasy IV's Battle 2 music enough to call a game a Final Fantasy? Because if so, Super Mario RPG is one.
I think we definitely hashed this out a little bit on the VG Draft, Curtis's other podcast, where I tried to make the case, even though I don't believe it, or it just worked for me in the moment, that Kingdom Hearts was a Final Fantasy game because of all of the Final Fantasy characters in it and stuff. But
I think that's the only time on that podcast that we were ever like, no, your opinion is wrong.
No,
you're not allowed.
no.
You're not allowed to do that.
I just want to talk about the song Sanctuary. That song's so good.
But for the uninitiated, last time we talked to Aidan our roles were reversed, and he was talking to us on behalf of Wired, talking about video game podcasts, specifically the book club format, which was really nice that we got to get featured on that. I guess probably because someone said something nice about us.
That'll teach him.
If I remember correctly, it was a Retrograde Amnesia
Retrograde
guys
Amnesia.
put me on to you, and I am I am a long time and big Final Fantasy fan, so it's been a pleasure kind of discovering your podcast. And we talked for that Wired piece that I did about book club style video game podcasts that dive deep into these games, not just talking about them for an episode or two, sort of like what we're doing here, but really diving deep like you guys do. And I dove deep into Japanese RPG history in last year and released a book in October called Fight Magic Items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And it covers, the magic, the kind of collaborative effort of the game that we're going to talk about today, and why that's so significant, and sort of what happened afterwards, which I think is just as interesting as what led to Square and Nintendo coming together, and then they had that little...
And then the inevitable falling out.
Yeah.
I'm exactly 52% of the way through it right now, according to my Kindle.
Yeah.
Excellent. Nice.
I've been really enjoying it. And
thank you.
But not just you kind of delving into each beat of almost game by game, and even some of the developers, okay, this person went on to do this, and or this person was going to this company to bring this idea, or even just what certain RPGs were kind of doing better, or everyone kind of getting their own personality or different kind of approach to what is considered the essential JRPG, but also framing it in a way that's your experience, because you grew up with all this while it was happening.
Yeah. I really wanted to center people and the stories about people and the emotions that that we have as creators and as fans. And so it explored some of the, the business behind what was going on, but really it digs into like, who were these people that created the genre and created, the Final Fantasies and the Dragon Quest and spawned something that became such a worldwide hit. What pushed them to do that? Like what was it about them? Like Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy, wanted to be a musician, and he kind of took on a role of Square part-time because he needed to sort of like, bide his time until he could, rock concert halls. And then he ended up sort of, changing video games, right? And Yuji Horii wanted to be a manga artist, right? And that was his drive. And same way he sort of like loved video games and sort of fell in backwards to creating, the other big, huge pillar of Japanese RPGs. But I don't think that's a coincidence. It tells you a lot about, like what making games was like at the time and what the people who went on to make games, like what drove them. They were always very creative. And that drove them into, exploring this new field because like they didn't grow up playing Japanese RPGs, right? Like that didn't exist.
Right.
So like, it was kind of this creative vision that they had and this like challenge that they saw to, make something that didn't exist before. And then the book, tackles how did the genre go from sort of like, a mildly successful niche genre in the West in North America to then like blowing up with Final Fantasy X. And exploring like why that happened, what was happening culturally in North America, with the arrival of anime and how Square was sort of gambling on Final Fantasy VII, even though it was like made specifically for like a Japanese audience. But still, they put a lot of money behind advertising it, and it just blew up, right? And it changed like what we perceived Japanese RPGs to be, what gaming could be, and it brought in like, millions and millions of new Japanese RPG fans. So looking at what happened there and then what happened afterwards, because the genre sort of went and sort of bifurcated a little bit. Things chasing like Final Fantasy cinematic vision, and other ones like staying closer to that 16-bit style Japanese RPG. And I think, it's really interesting to see how those have diverged and how they're kind of coming back together. We're seeing a lot of like younger creators in Japan, but also in the West, creating games that are, based on the games that they grew up loving, right? Sakaguchi and Horii didn't have that chance back then. Now you have people who grew up loving Final Fantasy VI or Phantasy Star or Dragon Warrior making new games. And so you're getting stuff like, I think, Octopath Traveler is really interesting in that way. The second one just came out. And then you have Western games like Chained Echoes, which is like this fabulous game created by a single person who like, it's full of homage, but it also feels like really respectful of that. It doesn't feel like it's drowning in homage. And it's like, you can tell this is a guy
with Earthbound and that.
Yeah, exactly. Undertale's a great example. So, you have these people, making games and they're shaped by the game, the experiences they had, right? And the book kind of comes full circle and follows people like Sakaguchi right to the end as he's talking about his latest game, Fantasian, and looking back on his career and how he's still trying to like perfect that formation, that form of game that he created and helped create so long ago. So, it really digs into people, the emotions that drive us, the things that tie us to the games that we love, and how that can inspire us in turn and create that next generation of video game and creator and fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing, because I didn't really know too much about like the beginnings, but how not just that JRPGs were like kind of inspired by like D&D a little bit. Like you mentioned the game Wizardry.
D&D is the obvious one, I feel like, but in your book you were talking about the D&D inspired video games, that video games were just becoming a new burgeoning, just, who knew like if it was going to be a fad. Like I'm sure a lot of things at the time was just like, oh well, this is just, it's like how we look at like yo-yos or something. Like there was that time in school where everyone was obsessed with yo-yos and everyone's getting into it, and then it went away, especially in America, where there was like the arcade game boom and then the crash of that right around the time when all these JRPGs were popping up and everything, and just kind of seeing, like you said, like this was a genre that did not exist before, so they were inventing something new on new hardware with tons of limitations and just tons of like staffing kind of things going on. New companies were creating, getting kids pretty much right out of college who had other aspirations. They're like, I just need a side job, and how it all kind of culminated to be something so perfect and create these games that then became industry defining, like not even just genre defining, but just video games as a whole, just the explosion that happened from it. It's very interesting to see from like the historical standpoint.
Narrative
of like
in games is like forever changed from RPGs.
Yeah, absolutely. And all like so many games and genres have adopted like Japanese RPG, like storytelling methods, but also like structure and systems and stuff over time. And I think that cultural exchange is really interesting, right? So where you have, D&D way back when inspired games like Ultima and Wizardry. Then you have people like Sakaguchi and Hori who are like, okay, like there had been like Japanese RPGs made for Japanese PCs before that, but like Hori and Sakaguchi said, okay, we love these games, Wizardry and Ultima. Nintendo has this new platform coming out. How do we transfer that experience like into Japanese living rooms, right? So it was not only taking, like the idea of like, how do we take a Dungeons and Dragons-esque and Ultima-esque experience and provide it to like, more people, but it was like, how do we fit it onto this tiny underpowered game console? But also, how do we make it appeal to, Japanese players as well? Like Dragon Quest feels very like steeped in Western tropes, right? To me, it feels like a very schlocky trope. Like I love Dragon Quest, but it feels like very schlocky and tropey, right? Because it's like the medieval, like faux medieval Europe setting.
Right.
I mean, the kind of manga style is almost inspired by like old Disney cartoons and some.
Exactly.
It's a very that goofy. I forgot the name. What was the manga artist who did like Dragon Ball and all that stuff?
Toriyama.
Toriyama. Yeah. His style is very playful. He wanted to keep it. They wanted to keep it kind of fun and like not too scary and like not as existential as Final Fantasy.
And then on the flip side, Final Fantasy is like key art and it's like art. By Yoshitaka Amano was very ethereal, very like emotionally driven, very dark. And the games, like, their graphics look very similar, but like from that art, you got different feel for what they were trying to portray. And so like, these creators were just like, trying to look at what they can do. And Hori took Western ideas, Western tropes, because to the Japanese players, that he was making the game for, those felt exotic, right? In the same way that to us, we play something like Okami and it feels very, exotic because it has, Japanese influence, Japanese culture and myth in there. And that feels, like something we haven't experienced in our own day-to-day life. And so like, you had these creators who were looking at their audience and trying to say, okay, how do we make something that appeals to Japanese players, like sitting in their living room 3 feet in front of their TV and give them that experience that we love so much playing Ultima and Wizardry, and then they created Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest. Those became huge hits in the West, and now you have Western creators who are sort of like re-inspiring the Japanese creators, and it's just like really beautiful cultural exchange, like that just like feeds and goes through these cycles of sort of like give and take, and I think that's really cool.
It's really interesting to see how that all like shakes out, because I mean it always happens. I think it's the same kind of thing that made Demon Souls and Dark Souls and Shadow Tower and all the From Software games so good and so just cool, because again, that's a fantasy setting like that has been done to death in the West, but in Japan, it was heavily influenced by Berserk, so they were like, oh, let's kind of make games that feel like they could fit into that universe, but it's not about guts and it's not about Griffith and all that, but it's a similar thing. And then it's like it's such a breath of fresh air that it brings a whole different spin and it's seeing it through a different lens, which then makes it interesting and not like as much of a trope, I guess.
I think what's a little bit interesting, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more when we get into our Final Fantasy II season, but like Final Fantasy II comes out in 88, and so Dragon Quest 1 is 86, Phantasy Star 1 and Final Fantasy are in 87, and these are all the first iterations of large Japanese RPGs taking inspiration from things like Ultima and Wizardry, right? And then you have like the first iterative one of them, I guess like Dragon Quest 2 possibly, but Final Fantasy 2 comes in and like is a different thing in that it is a little bit closer story-wise, I think, to what the later games become, with like betrayals and multiple characters and party members who die and stuff like that, and then come back later in the game, and like kind of an interweaving tale. And it's fun to kind of see, like, speaking of borrowing from the West, to start to see games that are JRPGs borrow from their previous iterations, and just like a year or two ago, and start incorporating a little bit more of their own personality, and seeing how like the JRPG blooms from that initial concept is kind of neat.
Yeah, that's what I really liked about the book so far. That I'm not as far along as Alex is, but just when you get to kind of talking about Final Fantasy II and just kind of like the rivalry that's there between Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy in the sense of like them competing with each other but being completely different things, and like the Dragon Quest like method was like, okay, well, we have this popular thing, we're going to do incremental changes. It's much like our game style is, you know, friendly and lighthearted and fun and not too deep. We're going to kind of just keep it the same, add just enough to make it, you know, another success, hopefully. And Sakaguchi and that gang was just like, okay, well, you know what? We're just going to do something completely fucking different. We're just taking it in a completely
They went off the deep end and Kawazu'd everybody with their second title. Like, you know, like I feel like you need to work up to Kawazu games, but not Square at the time. They just like went out there and that like sort of like ambition to like constantly change and evolve and to like explore new territory has served Final Fantasy really well. But I think most people would agree that, you know, those games are a little more up and down. And I think you find people who are like, you know, really like Final Fantasy VIII and people who really don't like Final Fantasy VIII, right?
Oh, you're the best one?
The best one. I'm pro one. Final Fantasy VIII. I think it's great. Yes. But, you know, the titles can be more divisive than the Dragon Quest titles, right? Like, I think, you know, people might look at Dragon Quest V and it's like, oh, that one's really creative. And that's, you know, that's the best one because of the family stuff, you know, which is fair. But it's, you know, it's not that different than the previous games, right? And like sort of consistency, I think, has served that series really well. You know, you played Dragon Quest 11, it feels not that much different than playing Dragon Quest 4, really.
I mean,
right?
To the point where these games have like modern Dragon Quest games have 2D mode, where you can literally just play the game looking like an old Dragon Quest, and you're like, oh yeah, this is just old Dragon Quest.
And like in the 3DS one, you could like play both modes at the same time, right? And like for that to happen, like it had to be structured like an old game that would work as a 16-bit JRPG, right? And I think that's really fascinating.
The only thing that's changed is the fidelity of graphics, and like everything behind the curtains is pretty much the same system as it always has been.
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
That's really, really interesting, especially just in not even just in like the JRPG sense, but in the gaming industry as a whole and the history of gaming. I think it's very interesting to look at like early games, like the first iterations and everything, like even something like Zelda, like the sequel to Zelda came out, and that game straight up has some JRPG elements. It's not as like robust as like, you know, leveling up in the same way that we think when we level up in Final Fantasy, but it's like you get a choice of, oh, I want more health or I want more magic and I want this and I have these experience points that I get.
That reminds me of an RPG that this episode might be.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same, but and like also with Mario as well. Like interesting with like the Nintendo method of like how are we going to handle the sequel? When they came out with the sequel, it was, you know, what we got as the lost levels, where they're like, okay, everyone who's played this game and wants to buy the second one has presumably played through all of Super Mario Bros. So we're going to make it for them, like the expert players. This is going to be a huge difficulty spike, and then Nintendo really reeled that back, and when they were localizing it, they're like, okay, well, this isn't going to work in the US because their player base are a bunch of babies who can't handle challenge.
I have so much to say about that one single point, which is, if that's the case, why are so many English versions of their games harder than the Japanese ones?
Exactly.
It's crazy.
It's so funny.
No one has ever beaten Seventh Saga. It's undoable. You can't beat that game.
World's first, coming at you, Curtis's Twitch channel.
Do you know though that the Japanese version of Seventh Saga is way easier, right?
It is. That's what I mean.
Yeah. And so you can get a patch now, a fan patch that reverts it to the Japanese difficulty, and it's actually a pretty cool game if you don't die on the very first random battle. And there is that weird like cultural idea that Americans are kind of sissies and want everything easy. But I think that's never really held true.
Trying to cast a wide net, I think, right?
You know,
it's funny too thinking about this as like when the developers started, and again, a new industry. They're inventing things. They're coming up with things as they go. They have assumptions about the markets that they're going to, which is backed up by the data of how the games sell and that sort of stuff. But just it's so funny that I heard a story. I don't know how true it is, but in the first Zelda, when they were playtesting it, people were saying it was too hard. So Miyamoto was like, okay, don't let them start with the sword, put the sword in the cave. And like that was the kind of thing. And then it's like, well, now Nintendo is like kind of just notorious for like way too much hand holding. And like to see a jump from like Zelda 1 to Zelda 2, or to see, these early games kind of making drastic changes in sequels is very interesting with how it all ended up kind of coming together decades down the road.
And I think like you look at Square's attempts at breaking into the Western market, like they were selling, X number of units, right? 500,000 units they might sell of a Japanese RPG, or Enix might sell in the West, right? At the time, they really wanted to break in. And so they did that by making Mystic Quest. Like they set out to create this like westernized version of Japanese RPG, and it compromised on all the things that eventually actually made Japanese RPGs take off in the West, right? Like Mystic Quest and Final Fantasy VII couldn't be different, like more different experiences, right? Mm-hmm. Like Final Fantasy VII at the time was so crunchy, but they took all of the interesting stuff that made Final Fantasy VII such a hit, stripped it out, and gave like Western gamers everything they didn't want, which is the hand holding and the like. I don't know.
The more action kind of oriented stuff of like.
I'm playing through Mystic Quest for the first time right now on stream, and like I just keep being like, Mystic Quest, time to press the A button. I hope you all love the A button. Just get through everything, and I'm just like,
that's what Mario uses to jump.
It's more like a book in that like A is the page turn button, less than like an actual video game.
But like one thing that drives me crazy about Mystic Quest is like, because I was playing it recently for the first time as well, and like every enemy uses status attacks. So like every battle, my characters are getting poisoned or whatever. Confusion. And it's like, this isn't fun. It's like, that's one of the not fun things about Japanese RPGs. But like, for a game that they wanted to appeal in the West and they wanted to make easy, they put a lot of friction in there that didn't need to be in there, right? Like, you go through those like battle arena areas, like, where you can sort of like grind and just go through 10 straight battles, and like nobody wants to sit there and just do 10 straight battles. I get the idea is that you're supposed to like, only go into combat or grind when you want to, but it doesn't come across that. It doesn't feel that way when you're actually playing it.
Yeah. It feels more like just an arbitrary, like you said, a gauntlet of enemies that is kind of arbitrary, that like, if you want to be the level to take the next boss decently, sit here and do this for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And just press A, because like if you have like a secondary character, they just heal you, so whatever, fine, fuck it. And just press A. And sometimes you'll be confused, and then you'll cast Quake and kill both of your party members, and there's nothing you can do about that. Just start over. But that probably won't happen. It's probably fine. And it's like, what is this? Like, this is such a weird choice.
But like, you gotta get the water drinking bird to just hit A for you, and you go make dinner or something.
Music is badass though.
By the end of the Super Nintendo lifespan, though, to sort of segue us towards what we're meant to talk about, is like, I think Square did figure out how to take some of that sort of action-based gameplay and inject it successfully into a Japanese RPG, right? And incorporate things that were a little more. You needed to pay attention. You needed to look at everything that was happening in combat, right? So Mystic Quest dumbed things down so much that you just jam an A. But what really sort of started to bring later Super Nintendo JRPGs to life is that, like, you had to pay attention during those battles and be more engaged, and maybe they were a little quicker. But you were constantly being asked to like perform within those. And that hit, like, I think there was a path forward there for what Mystic Quest was trying to do, but I think they needed to, instead of like being so reductive, it needed to be more creative. And as we talk about today's game, I think we'll see how Square finally pulled that off.
And you see a little bit of it in FF6 too, with the different like specials where you have
blitzes
like
and stuff.
Blitzes just waiting for Cyan's like meter to build and then press A at the right time, like certain timing. And so it does seem like they're trying out these ideas there, and like having in FF6 having 14 different characters with 14 different mechanics, some of which have time and button and press parts to them. You can be like, you can see how they've tried out a lot of different methods of attacking the enemy. And I guess that brings us to 1996, right?
Yeah, I think around like 94, if I remember correctly, is when they started development of this, which is pretty late in the Super Nintendo's lifespan as well. Like I think development had already been happening as well on N64. So it's
that came out the same year as this game.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
It's 6 months apart or something like that.
I think Aidan, you might be able to speak on this a little more than I could, but I think Super Mario RPG was almost like explicitly made to be an RPG that was palatable to the Western audience after some, not the most success of these otherwise massively successful games. So that's kind of why they wanted to bring in Nintendo and use Nintendo properties, which everyone in the US already had, like familiarity with and a love for, and kind of just give it more of a, an intro to the JRPG or the RPG genre in the West.
Did Square approach Nintendo like, hey, how can we make something that's like more friendly? Like, I guess because they've tried with like almost like a mentorship or something.
Yeah, and I mean, we were also like really entering like, that was a big phase in sort of Western culture where like mascots were so important, right? We kind of started to move away from that a little bit, starting with the PlayStation era. Like PlayStation never really nailed down like a mascot character, but it was so important during like the NES and the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Like, you had the Sonic and Mario rivalry, right? And so like bringing that in and Square, was so synonymous with the Super Nintendo, and their hits, their big games were all on, the NES and Super Nintendo and the Game Boy. And so like, they just seemed like they almost felt like a second party or, developer, somebody that was, they worked with Nintendo. They made Nintendo games, and together those two companies built up the Japanese RPG genre. And so like, when they sort of came together and it's like, okay, like what's the Holy Grail? What's Nintendo's Holy Grail? And that's Mario. Is like, what can you do with this? And, I think that what's really interesting when Square and Nintendo finally came together to make Super Mario RPG, which is what we're talking about today, is like, it was really, it took a lot of risks, right? Like it's a weird game, and it feels like there's a lot of Square in there. Whereas now you get to the point where you look at the Mario RPGs, and like they're so sanitized. Like I loved Origami King, right? It was great.
I like that game too. Yeah.
The combat was weird and unnecessary, but like the world was great. But you've still gotten to a point where like now within the guidelines for Mario, they can't like create new characters within these worlds. They can't like dress up characters. So you have all the Toads now look the same, right? And it's like it's so tightly wound around like brand guidelines for Mario, but like. You look back at Super Mario RPG and it was just weird, right? Like Malo is you have a Cloud who thinks he's a frog, who and it rains when he cries.
Weird is like underselling too, because
Booster,
you've got like Bowser's on your team. Like there's no way Nintendo would let Square do this kind of stuff now, but back then it was like they were a little looser with the rules, and I think that really allowed the game to shine in a way that surprised everybody, but also felt like it didn't just feel like you were going through another routine in the Mushroom Kingdom. It was like, okay, no, here's a world that like, it feels familiar, but like, oh, hey, Bowser's not the bad guy. Who's this sword? So like that unfamiliarity, that kind of creative vision that Square brought allowed them to create a world that felt like there were mysteries. So it didn't feel like it was just, like the Mushroom Kingdom again. And you have to save Princess. Like it starts off that you have to save Princess Peach. But as you move on, the stakes change. And I think that was really compelling. And I don't know that Nintendo would do that anymore.
I feel like they would actively not do that. I think Nintendo, the more time that passes, they seem to kind of just make more and more like baffling decisions. It's like, they like, I don't think they would ever make another Super Mario RPG in the same vein of what you're talking about. Yet at the same time, they're happy to just be like, yeah, you know what, give Mario a gun, let him hang out with the Rabbids, as a weird tactic.
Rabbids is the closest thing I can think of that is like going off the rails. Like, oh yeah, what if it was XCOM and you have characters who are pretending to be
put princesses, XCOM. An ugly rabbit is wearing Princess Peach's dress. Like, sure,
they're borderline minions,
I guess they are massively popular in that market, though. In Europe, I believe, kind of like the Minions over there or something. If I understand correctly, I don't know too much about that franchise.
So the Rabbids are like at very least like an established franchise, and it kind of makes me wonder, like, are the characters of Super Mario RPG in the universe of Super Mario? right? Like,
Yeah.
because we never see Gino again. We never see
That
Malo
is
again.
that is not entirely true.
If you say Super Mario, if you say Smash Brothers, I'm gonna throw you out the window.
No. I'm not talking about the
Okay.
costuming. So in one of the Superstar Saga games, which I think was created by like some of the same developers, obviously, I don't think it was Square because of the falling out that they had with Nintendo. But Gino is in one of the
former Square employees, I think, were in that development.
Yeah, was working on that game,
Okay.
and I think was the creator of Gino, and had no idea that everyone loved Gino and that Gino was like a cult hit. It was kind of just like, he was in that game and then we forget about him forever. And then he kind of found out that a lot of people really love Gino and he's got this big fan base. So as like a show of like good faith for that, I guess, or whatever, he put him in as like a little cameo in one of the games.
Oh, that's cute. Okay.
Yeah, but again, never in any other games to have any substantial amount.
Yeah.
But
The thing about Gino is he's like not even a character, right? Like that's just a doll in the Super Mario RPG universe, right? Like
true.
Gino could manifest as anything, but that doll has become so iconic with the game. And I think because it's such a weird, like, it's a weird marionette, it's not a particularly nice character design, right?
it's a character design that works because it's the same thing with Ronnie the Witch in Elden Ring.
Yeah. Sure.
Essentially the same character as Gino.
Yeah. I can see that. It's all.
I just recently played through, in preparation for this, I just played through Super Mario RPG again, but I played it in Japanese. What is the place Gino comes from called in the English one?
Star Road.
Road. Okay, it's Star Pass in the in Japanese, and I kept being like, "What is the name of it?" I couldn't remember.
I call it like a Starway, and like, no, it's not.
Everyone always gets the name wrong in the English version, at least, and everyone's like, and Gino's like, "No, it's Star Road."
Star Ocean. Playing through this for the first time and like knowing kind of where it sits, like, okay, this is like between 6 and 7. I actually can like feel a little bit of like Square's design senses carry over from this to 7. Like a lot of the pre-rendered backgrounds, even like the mini game segments feel very like straight out of Final Fantasy 7. Like
that's a good point.
the going down the river on the barrels, falling down the waterfalls and stuff. And like,
yeah.
It's interesting you say that too, because I think
Mario and Gang gets in a submarine and shoots a
the style, like the isometric style. Originally, they wanted it to be kind of more like Final Fantasy, where it's just top down, 2-dimensional and all of that. But when they saw what other developers were doing with the technology in the Super Nintendo, they got really, really impressed, particularly Rare and Donkey Kong. And they were like, we got to try something with
system,
this.
Right? I think they use the same like rendering engine, more or less. Like
I'm not sure about that, but I do know that it's
computers at least.
It's one of the few Super Nintendo games that uses a special chip called the SA1 chip, which is a very beefed up. It really helps beef up the games on the Super Nintendo.
I mean, I kind of miss those days in which, like, oh yeah, your system isn't powerful enough. We'll just include some extra hardware on the game itself, so your computer can play it. Like, that seems like I miss those eras.
I feel like with the N64 coming out as well, like they killed Star Fox 2 on the Super NES because they were afraid of showing off like too much of what the Super Nintendo could do, right? They had this 3D, like this polygonal console coming out, and that was a selling point, right? Was look at we can do 3D, and you had Star Fox 2, and it was like, oh wait, Super Nintendo can already do pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, why are you
with
trying
3D.
to sell me another?
So
one?
why are you trying to sell me a new console? And I do wonder if some of that transition that you're talking about, Carl, was like, they knew the N64 was coming, right? But they had this, they did have a new game to sell, and Donkey Kong Country had come out and was a big hit, and that pre-rendered like graphic style was really, really popular at that time. They wanted Yoshi's Island to originally look like Donkey Kong as well, but then Miyamoto sort of pushed them towards that crayon style.
And he was right.
He was absolutely right. It's
just like he was right to not give Mario a sword in Super Mario RPG. He was right about this.
Yes, absolutely. But I feel like it was a good decision to go with those pre-rendered graphics because I don't know, it seems like it added to sort of that weird dark undertone to me, like that.
Sure.
That feels unique to a world that if it just had sort of like 16-bit like Final Fantasy style pixel art, I'm sure it would have been gorgeous, but it would have, I don't know. I kind of like how archaic and weird the graphics feel now. Like it feels, Paper Mario took the series in this direction where it's papercraft, right? Super Mario RPG almost feels like it's like, plasticine or it's something, or it's constructed of something because the technology was immature. Amiibo. It feels
toy-like
to
the Amiibos.
And I think that's interesting at that time.
It feels very tactile.
Yeah. Tactile is a good word for it.
I love the like interaction between characters, like the weird device that Mario doesn't really talk. He just has like pantomime everything that happens. And how
That
is
is
so
good.
funny. That
It's
is
like
like one of the smartest ideas. Like the art and the writing, like the directions that they took it in are so good because like they're all so unique that they stand on their own. Like I could just say like Mario RPG, look at that art style. How good is that art style? But you could also be like Mario RPG, the comedy. How good is that comedy? There's
It's
so many
amazing. I think
it's so good. It all comes together so well.
The developers also, I think, have like gone on record saying that they were like big fans of like stand-up comedy at the time. So they were like, they wanted to make it funny, and I think they really succeeded. There's like points where I was when playing through recently for this episode, I was like, my fiance and I were just like laughing out loud at like what is going on, and it's like it's very cute, it's very funny, and the charm is just like unbeatable. I think it probably could have had that with a different art style, but I think separate the art style separates it so far away from other Mario games, especially at the time, that it gave it its own like unique universe and its own feeling entirely, which really helped it stand out on its own.
I love when they, speaking of like some of my favorite bits or whatever in the game, I love when you get to the Cloud Kingdom and they're like, we found Prince Malo, and it's just a giant bird. and the people are like, well, heavy. I mean, maybe. They're like trying to like be like, I guess he could just be a giant bird now. We haven't seen him in a long time.
It's so good.
I think like what's so good about it is it's like, we're talking about cultural exchange, and I think that visual like humor is like so cross-cultural. Like you have that
slapstick and visual comedy is super. It transcends language sometimes. I mean,
totally.
My favorite bits in the beginning is like this is something different. Is like when Mario falls from the Bowser's castle, and then he's hanging on the wall like with his other costume. with the
so
you don't even notice him there for like, wait a second. Oh, Mario's in.
Yeah, the use of the jump button is really funny too. I actually I was checking. Right. I have when I played this game, I have a cart of it that I got way cheaper than I probably should have, like years and years ago. But I also recently picked up a Japanese copy of it, which is way easier to get and way cheaper. Like if you've seen on the resale market Super Mario RPG, it's kind of notorious in the West of being super expensive, but there's a lot more copies in like the Japanese versions of it. So I was kind of like looking through the manual, which I also have, of both of them, and like kind of comparing them. And one of the things, like the manual is also really cute. And I assume they did this in the Japanese one as well, even though I didn't read it, but they have pictures of Luigi on there. And originally Luigi was supposed to be in the game, but then for whatever reason, they didn't include him in it. And
what do you mean? All those mole people? The mole Luigis.
In the manual, though, the first page has like Luigi on there, and he's like, "Hi there, my brother Mario is off on a new adventure, it looks like, but he doesn't need my help this time, so I'm going to help you by explaining how to use the Super Nintendo controller."
Oh, that's cute.
And it's like every now and then there's just like an image of Luigi like with his like finger up or something telling you about something in the game. But it says something like, if you're ever talking to someone and it seems like you can't move, they probably just want to see Mario jump, so hit the B button. And that's another thing that like is very funny, where it's like, yo, nice, Curtis. Wait, Curtis, can I see yours really quick? There was another thing I wanted to talk about. Can I see the cover really
absolutely.
quick?
Curtis is holding up the Famicom version, Super Famicom.
Yeah, so if you look in the corner there, Curtis, do you want to? I don't know if you can read that for us, but the thing that says 4,000 yen. No, the other one.
Oh, the other one. Yeah, 4,000 yen.
I can tell you what it says. Maybe not like completely.
Kaeru. Aku Kaeru?
What they did, this kind of goes into what Aidan was saying about like, how close it was with the N64 coming out and Star Fox with
is it a coupon?
It is a coupon that they included in Japan that you would get $40 off a Super Famicom if you bought Super Mario RPG.
Oh, yeah. Coupon Chotsuki.
And that was probably just a clever marketing thing to be like, well, we have all this backstock of Super Famicoms. How do we move them, especially when we're going to be selling N64s soon? And I think it really worked out. I think it helped, like that's like, like $40 essentially. Given whatever the exchange rate was at the time, but
it's probably a lot more back then in the 80s or 90s, 96.
I think what's also interesting is like I feel like the end of a console lifespan is when a lot of younger kids start getting consoles because they're cheap, right? The Super Famicom, the Super Nintendo was quite cheap at that point. And I think that a lot of the decisions, like especially with the visual storytelling, visual humor, like the node-based map in Super Mario RPG was designed to allow younger kids to kind of come in and hopefully, they love Mario, right? And so they need something that's accessible for them. And if they can't read or they're not confident reading, at least they get the gist of the story, right? They see what's happening. And that's something that, we talk about Final Fantasy VII doing really well, is like Final Fantasy VII shows so much of the action, right? And it brought that sort of cinematic, like movie-like narrative style and storytelling method to Japanese RPGs. And that's what Sakaguchi had always wanted to do, but I think you see a bit of it, like even more like Final Fantasy VI started it a little bit. It has a lot of like great like sprite acting, very emotive characters, but like Super Mario RPG is like even a big step above that. And like I played a lot of, I'm the oldest of 3 boys in my family, and my youngest brother, who's about 5 years younger than me, he would watch me play a lot of Japanese RPGs. And I can't remember if he watched me play this one, but this is one, I was in grade 7, so he would have been in like grade 2, right? Just learning to read, but he would have, like seen that and been able to follow along and got all the gags. And if he's wandering around the map and doesn't know where to go, well, you leave town and like the next node is just always there, right? There's you don't need to like, there's not a lot of backtracking in the game where you have to like bounce around and figure out where to go next. It's like, as soon as you leave the location you're at, the next node is there, you know where to go. You can get the broad strokes of the story, like, Malo's dad sort of floating in on his little thing, like, his little like fishing rod, like, you can tell just right there that he, like he's this old sage guy who's trying to impress you. And there's like, he starts lowering down and stuff. And like that stuff tells the story, even if the, like the depth of what's there with the written words doesn't quite come across. And I think that's so important when you have like a game and they're saying, hey, get $40 off a Super Famicom. It's like, okay, let's try to get some younger kids into this genre. And I think that's a really effective way of doing that.
Yeah.
So, have any of you gotten the super suit or the jumpsuit?
I don't think I have. No.
The Various suit?
Yeah.
I did get the lazy shell, though.
Yeah, I usually get the lazy stuff, but like the jumping, you get it with the 100 jumps, right?
100 jumps.
Yeah, I can't.
Never done it.
Rhythmic
is that
enough.
Jumping in battle, or is that?
Yeah.
If you do 100 super jumps in a row.
Oh,
now, do you know the mechanics behind the super jump specifically, Curtis? I haven't really looked it up yet. My high score right now is like at 19, I think.
Yeah, it's around where mine is.
I think it's after like 15 or 16, it becomes like just straight up frame perfect, right? And
is it frame perfect?
I think it is frame perfect, and I think this game runs at 60 FPS.
God.
This is why hardware is more important. You don't have to like input latency and stuff like that.
Yeah, and if you're ever playing on an emulator or you're playing on a flat screen or you're using a wireless controller, it just doesn't seem like worthwhile, right? Like I play on a CRT. I do have
flashback to us lightning dodging an FF10 on the ports.
Yeah, exactly. If you're trying to play that on modern hardware, like, and you're not playing one of the remasters, it's just like you're toast, right? And like, old consoles don't get credit for, I think, how responsive they are. People have forgotten or just never experienced that.
Oh my goodness!
This is why Melee is still like the standard for fighting games and like the Nintendo fighting games. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That actually brings up another good point about, so we're talking about obviously a Japanese RPG game and how it was, brought to the Western market. An interesting thing is it was never localized in the PAL region, like outside of Japan. And the reason for that is kind of what you're talking about with the TVs and everything, because a lot of care had to go into that. There was different refresh rates in the European market. So when they were kind of, I guess, doing like a business analysis of it, they're like, okay, well, 1, here's our first hurdle. We would have to retranslate it again, maybe from English into whatever languages of the regions that we're going to. 2, we would need to change.
Do search replace O and put OU.
Yeah. We would need to change the refresh rate on the TVs so that it could play on their TVs as well. So they were like, we're not going to do that. So it wasn't until much later that
you're changing all the
that market got to
all the
see
code to compensate for the frames. Yeah.
Going down to 50 hertz would mess up like all the button time stuff in the in combat as well. I hadn't considered that before. They just weren't releasing.
Yeah, I just found that out today as well, and I was like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, you know what though? They got Terranigma, so what do they have to complain about?
They didn't get Chrono Trigger though, so
so sad.
And like, did Terranigma really get localized? Like, are we really gonna like credit it with it? I don't know if that's English in that game, but no, I'm being hard on that game. It's great, but But Super Mario RPGs always puzzled me because it was in English, right? And so like an English power release did seem like it would have made sense. But yeah, the 50 hertz TVs is interesting.
I think also the production cost with the SA1 chip kind of really factored into that as well, because
maybe so.
At that point, older technology and everything, so they were able to kind of mass produce Super Nintendo cartridges a little easier, but with that added SA1 chip, which I think only like 34 games on the entire Super Nintendo library have, and only 7 of them made it outside of Japan.
Oh, it didn't come in until the Wii U in 2015.
Yeah. So like much later. Yeah. That's their Mother 3.
I'm highly considering taking apart my cartridge while we talk and finding the SA1 chip on the board.
It's the one that says SA1 Nintendo on
You got
it.
your iFixit?
I do have
it's
my
funny. I actually have a
set.
kind of a tangential story about the SA1 chip, where I think I'm not sure if it's this Brazilian ROM hacker who was able to kind of develop for SA1 chips in like emulation, but I kind of saw his name come up. But I was familiar with this chip because I've been getting more and more into Super Mario World ROM hacks, like the really difficult like Kaizo ones. And there was one that I was trying to play, and I play on hardware with my Super NT, and I was trying to play it and it just wouldn't load. I'm like, oh, that's weird. And then I saw people in the forums kind of talking about, oh yeah, that needs an SA1 chip, which the EverDrive doesn't have. But when I got my Steam Deck, I put all of the ROMs on RetroArch and realized that I could play that game, and it's called A Plumber for All Seasons, and it's a very cute, like,
So I've been playing it.
Nice. It's like a kind of beginner difficulty Kaizo hack that's like hard enough, but like the art style, and it's really cute. It's about Mario just going through all the seasons and different gimmicks in it in the Super Mario World style. It's really nice.
You know what? I actually found in my copy, it does have the coupon.
Oh, that's so good. I was trying to find it online. I didn't have that.
And like it actually like on the back, it has like the information you have to fill out, where you put like your name, the store you got it from.
Oh, so it's more
your,
like a
telephone
rebate,
number. Yeah, and you actually put like the date, and then the store has a place to like sign that they've actually like sold it to you and stuff like that.
That's so cool.
That's pretty cool.
Now I'm gonna want to.
I never thought about what that was until you said that, and yeah, that's that's the actual coupon.
I want to collect more of those so I can get the coupon.
Or if it's still valid. It's like when you can still call the Nintendo like hot tip
we
line.
Still get one.
They just have one guy at Square. Just
it actually comes too with a like handy card that has all the skills and all the skills do and all the items do on it.
It's a cool package, yeah. It also has a different color palette Luigi in the manual compared to the US one. It was very weird. Like,
yeah,
you just the inking, how the old printing process.
I was wondering if it had to do with printing, but it seems a little more. I don't know. It seems a little more like intentional.
Yeah, if the map is all the same color, but Luigi is not the same color.
Yeah, but
discussions about the actual cartridge.
Doing real in-depth dives on Super Mario RPG. Now we're going to talk in depth even more about the SA1 chip. It's got 17 pins. I don't know.
Talking more about this game. This game was directed by Chihiro Fujioka. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Who else? What else did they do? Chihiro Fujioka. Yeah.
He was a director for Hamtaro games.
Nice.
Earthbound. No, that's not. That's a different Earthbound. That is 1983.
Different Earthbound. He worked on Final Fantasy Legend and Mystic Quest. Legend 3 specifically.
I just listened to the Final Fantasy Legend 3 OST yesterday for the first time. It has a song called Eat the Meat on it, and I think that's very funny.
Nice. And I think that's beautiful.
But it looks like he went on to do all the like the Mario and Luigi Superstar like games.
He also did metal percussion on Saga Scarlet Grace. So he's got a big music background as well, which is kind of interesting. I know you guys are, big into music and stuff, but it looks like it kind of ties back to what we were talking about with Nintendo trying to break into the West, because he did the story on Mystic Quest. We were talking about Mystic Quest earlier.
Yeah, you're right.
And so he was like involved in that, and I think that like I see a lot of similarities in terms of how they were trying to like inject like not necessarily like, I mean, with Mystic Quest, definitely a Western philosophy, but like, like a more sort of like wider worldview in terms of how they were approaching Super Mario RPG. And I'm not surprised to see some staff tying back to Mystic Quest, because I think that was, Mystic Quest was a valiant first try, but there were a lot of lessons there. Whereas I think at the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, like Super Mario RPG like presents as a really solid like experience that really understood how to make a game that appealed, across, not just demographics and countries, but like types of players as well. That's really what Mystic Quest wanted to do and didn't. And Super Mario RPG, like they figured it out. And I think that's really interesting in sales connections.
It goes into like the mechanics as well. Like I know we kind of didn't talk about it specifically, but there's like if you're not familiar with it in the battle mechanics, it's like any other kind of JRPG, but they added a different element to kind of make it a little bit more like an action RPG, like more of a passive active RPG, I guess, where there's a timing that you can do, where if you time your hit right, you pretty much guarantee a critical hit. And we all know that every good JRPG has something where if you hit a button at the right time, you get a critical hit.
That's right. Legend of Dragoon learned this well.
Final Fantasy VIII.
yeah, Final Fantasy VIII. That's right.
And I think that's part of them trying to like, because during this whole development, it's like, how are we going to marry like what makes a Mario game and what makes like an RPG, a good JRPG? And they wanted to kind of make it feel like you're still controlling Mario even when it wasn't his turn or after you actually hit the command button.
Yeah.
Because like outside of like doing timing to not just defend and attack on right times, there are like platforming sections in the overworld, which I think is cool.
Which I am extremely bad at.
Especially with isometric view with when you only have a D-pad to really work with.
The UI is really interesting too, because you don't just press A in battle, right? Like A is attack, but like you use all four of the face buttons. And I think that ties into the same thing where it feels like you're doing a little bit more than you are. You're still just using items, you're still just using magic, but because you have to use all four of the face buttons, I think that's like really trying to encapsulate that idea of like, hey, your favorite Mario platformer uses a lot of the buttons on the controller. How can we replicate that in a Japanese RPG? And that's really clever.
Yeah, it's smart.
Yeah, remind me a little bit of, because I'm playing a World of Final Fantasy in which each face button actually corresponds to like a different monster in your stack.
Oh yeah.
So it creates like these cool little kind of intuitive shortcuts. Instead of you just navigating a menu to the next item, you just like know like, okay, I have to hit X and then this shortcut, and then it feels more tactile.
Yeah. It's really cool that like in battle in Super Mario RPG, to advance through any menu is always to press the button that opened that menu. Yeah. So like if you're using items, you need to press X to open the items, X to select the item, X to confirm who you're using it on, and all of the other buttons become cancel, which I think is very interesting. It's like a very fun way to do it. Or like when you're doing timed hits, right? Like B is defend, and if you press B or A, I think, when you're being attacked, you'll do a timed defense.
Yeah.
And then, like, if you're wanting to do timed special attacks, you have to hit Y at the right time, which is your special button. So it is fun how they incorporate all the face buttons into it.
Only the Paradigm system did that.
Have you guys used Geno Whirl, I think is the name of one of Geno's special attacks?
Is that the hold it until 3 things go up?
No. That's one that I just last night.
This is the one where he does... Is this the one where he does 9999 damage?
This is one where if you time it right.
Is this his flare?
It's his flare, yeah.
If you time it right, you get just quad 9s. It's incredible. And every time I've done it, like the first time I tried it, I was like, whoa. I was like, that must have been really lucky or something. And then I realized it was a time thing. The only thing is that doesn't work on bosses, because then that would just be you win the game. You hit the button to win the game. So anytime I used it on a boss, it would do like almost no damage. And I'm like, oh, it's probably a big risk reward, frame perfect, you have to get it right. And then I was like, oh no, it just doesn't work on them. And I'm really good at getting it. I just didn't know that it didn't work on bosses.
One thing that like, I've been playing Super Mario RPG for like, since it came out, right? I've played it a lot. But as I was playing it this weekend in preparation for today's recording, I was like, I've gotten so used to like the haptics and the HD rumble on modern console controllers that like I was missing that sort of feedback, and I wasn't always certain like if I had hit A at the right time for like a critical, or if I had gotten that, like, you know, like they have visual cues, but they're pretty subtle sometimes, right? And so like I'm especially
or audio cues.
Yeah, they have the audio cues as well when you get it right. But it also changes depending on what weapon you have. So like I'll hear a noise and I'll be like, I don't know if that's the good noise or the bad noise.
Yeah. And like Gino's little thing that you were talking about earlier, like where the 3 stars go up, boop, boop, boop.
Yeah.
Like,
hey, how's that work?
You're supposed to, I think you're supposed to let go when there's 3 stars,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yes.
But
yes.
it gives you like no indication except, I guess, the amount of damage that you're doing, right?
Yeah, you would have to compare with
Yeah, so what I did when I played it this time is I intentionally did it wrong first to hear and see what happened. And then I was like, okay, I have been doing it right.
Yeah.
Because there isn't like a little boing or anything like that like lets you know you did it right.
Yeah. The stars don't turn green, like where you let go or whatever. So it's like, it's just funny how like even after all these years, I've sort of been trained to expect a bit more feedback, tactile feedback through a controller or sound or whatever.
Bowser's too, with the rotation, it doesn't really show you anything for that.
What you need to do for the Gino one is open up the manual. I forget what page it's on, but it gives a breakdown of how to time everything, and it'll say when you see 3 stars, you can stop, and you don't want to overcharge.
Your little cheat sheet. You're gonna look.
I want to
at
say
it
it's like.
I was gonna say I'll tell you right now.
I think at the end of the manual, it has a breakdown of almost every character and kind of tells you everything. They're just vague.
Can I say? It has 2 dedicated pages for every character except Peach, who gets none.
I know. I was like, I was so confused. I was like,
up.
okay, like the thing that me and my fiance landed on, and that is like, okay, I guess she's like the hidden. She's not a hidden character. You definitely get
she's
her.
She's the Vincent or the Yuffie of the game.
She's the last one that you get. So we're like, maybe it's a secret because
trying to avoid spoilers, I guess.
Yeah.
But they put Bowser in it. What could be a bigger spoiler than like Bowser's on your team?
But the whole story revolves around saving Princess Peach, right? So if she's there as a playable character, that would spoil, like, you know,
maybe so.
That aspect of it, but that's still pretty suspicious.
Page 39, by the way, is the one that shows you. I
was going to say 39.
It's how to show you how to do every Gino special.
Speaking of feedback, this is something I'm just kind of intuiting. I mean, I haven't quite 100% figured it out, but after some battles, you get an offer to do like double it or
lucky. Yes.
I groan every time I get that.
And I think I could be totally wrong, but there's like a drum roll, and I think the last, like, there's like a little bit of audio cue that kind of hints maybe which shell it is.
Oh, really?
At the very end, because I've noticed like, oh wait, the drum roll, and then there's like, as it slows down, I think there's like either 1, 2, or 3 like little extra like accented hits. I could be totally wrong, but to me, it was like, wait, this sounds different. And I tried it and like, oh, I got it. Like,
I find that one impossible because it tries to do this like 3D like spin, like they're on a platter that's spinning really fast. Instead of doing like the
shells.
The shells, it like spins like it's on a platter, and it's like, it's impossible for me to
What
track.
is that called? Is that three card Monty?
Yeah.
So like if any little hint that I can take is helpful.
I've just kind of started just guessing. I'm leaving it up. I'm like, it's RNG as far as I'm concerned. It'll be like, 1/3 chance that I get it.
The way I figured out to do it is to literally put my finger in front of the screen and then like draw along with it and be like, there it is.
Okay, so it actually does work like that. Interesting. I'm just really bad
it's
at
visually consistent. Yeah.
Wow. I'm blaming my HDMI connection for it. I'd be nailing it on a CRT.
Yeah, like if you like slow it down and watch the egg, it will be in the right place.
Oh yeah, it's called Where's Yoshi?
Where's Yoshi?
It's funny because it's like, it doesn't, like, the game is so like perfectly balanced that like you're never really going to need more money than what you're already given. You're never really going to need more experience. Like, there's no real reason to do it, right? As long as you fight the battles and you don't run, like, the game is just pitch perfect in its balancing. So it's a funny risk reward thing that doesn't really pay off. If you,
I find that there's one place where it matters, and it doesn't matter gameplay wise, but it matters bravery or cowardice wise, and that is in the Johnny Jonathan Jones fight, because when you beat the little the sharks hanging out with him, they give you luckies. Like, all 4 of them will give you luckies, and it is an experience lucky too. And I'm like, if you are truly brave, you will take the lucky no matter what. Like, you will risk it all because that's macho.
I mean, the odds are in your favor as well.
Yeah, right. right? Because
like it's 1/3. One is a tie, which just gets you what you were normally going to get anyway. One is you get double, and then the other is you don't get anything. So it's
So you only have a 33% chance of losing anything.
Really?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
for me was 100% of the time.
Yeah, 100% of the time for me as well.
And
Every time.
my fiance's been watching me play. This is her favorite. This is like her favorite game of all time. And she was watching me play. And every time I saw Lucky on the screen, I would just groan. And she's like, you don't have to do it. And I was no, I do have to do it.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do have to do it.
Just because your fiance is watching, you have to do it. It's like carrying all the groceries in at once.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be actually a decent segue into something else as well. The audio cues for the timed hits, the fact that there might be a little drum roll at the end of the lucky thing or whatever, to talk about some music. But before we get into that, before we break that Yoshi egg open, perhaps we should retire to one of the Mushroom Kingdom's many inns and take a quick break and get that little scene where that little snot bubble kind of grows out of our nose while we sleep.
Get that little scene where Link is.
Have you all been to? Y'all have been to Monstro Town, right?
Oh yeah,
already.
Yeah,
have you been there yet,
we
Alex?
have to talk about Monstro Town at some point.
I love when the ghosts come out and they go like, "What's that thing popping out of his nose? That's so unnatural." Like while he's sleeping. Anyway, I'll see you after the break. In this game, there is a little thing called Booster's Tower music. One of the Booster's Tower thing. I'm cutting right to it. We're going right to it.
Is this the first game Booster's in?
I think it's maybe the first and only game Booster's in. Is Booster in other things? Well, it doesn't matter because here's the thing. They got it in one. They crafted the perfect character and then gave him the perfect theme. And like you don't need Booster ever again.
Everyone was complaining about Gino not making it into Smash Ultimate. Like they should have put Booster in.
I guess there's Wario now, which is like
yeah, he's
like,
kind of
at heart like he's Wario. Booster.
Yeah,
there's definitely like crossover that like I do wonder if Booster was meant to be Wario at some point.
Oh,
like,
I wonder.
The designs are very close,
really
right?
Close.
But then they spun Wario off into his own line of like platformers, and I wonder if there was sort of like. If that's when he became Booster.
Yeah, I'm trying to
instead of Wario.
Wario was introduced in Super Mario Land 2, I think, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's the final
right.
boss.
Yeah.
As like your brother.
Coins.
Yeah, 6 gold coins. So
God, that game is so good.
Yeah.
And then the Wario games, and then Pizza Tower.
Yeah.
And then Pizza Tower. And eventually he becomes Peppino. Or maybe Booster becomes Peppino. It's hard to say. It's like two universes to branch off into. But
I love this scary man.
I want to talk about what is the lead instrument in that song? Is it
oh my God, that's a
baritone sax that's always on growl? Is that what it is? I think that's what it's supposed to be. I'm not sure, but it's great.
I love the beginning of it because the first time we hear it is when he opens his mouth super wide. So I think it's his. You think it's his?
It's so good.
It's just like.
We need to get Yoko Shimomura on the phone right now.
Have you guys seen like the fan projects to like they go back and they find the original samples for all these like Super Nintendo games and then like reconstruct all of these Super Nintendo like soundtracks with the original uncompressed
I have not
sound samples, and so like that might be the key there is figuring out.
They did that with a lot of like GoldenEye and stuff like that because like Grant Kirkhope used like a pretty standard like workstation synth, and they just had to compress the samples to fit on the cartridge. So there's like a high definition version that's now online.
They're wild. You can find them on YouTube. They're great.
I don't know that project specifically, but some friends of ours are just amazing, like chiptune musicians and just amazing guys in general. They had a podcast for a while called Retro Game Audio, where they do real deep dives into old retro game sound chips and things of that nature. And they a big our buddy Bucky or Patrick, I should say. Patrick
or Dark Souls
or
Dissected
Illusory Wall. Yeah.
Illusory Wall. Yeah.
He used to have a channel on YouTube that he doesn't upload to anymore, but it's just all rips from original hardware of soundtracks. Because a lot of times, people would kind of not do the best rips of it or add.
Do not add reverb to your
add
to your
reverb
game
to
rip
try
when
and
you
make it
put it
sound
on
better
YouTube.
on YouTube or something. But no, that's really interesting. I would definitely like to check that out. I do know, Alex, what you were talking about with Grant Kirkhope. I think I saw a thing that David Wise was pretty inspired by In the Air Tonight, and pretty much just took that synth tone and tried to make it in Donkey Kong, which became Stickerbush Symphony or Aquatic Ambience or whichever song, which is so sick.
That makes sense. Such good music. Speaking of music.
Yeah, speaking of music, so the composer, Yoko Shimomura, right? One of the RPG greats.
Mm-hmm.
She's great. I haven't played any of her games, but I did not realize this person went on. I mean, she's known for Live a Live and Kingdom Hearts, and then Final Fantasy 15.
I was going to say, actually, I was like, let's talk about Yoko Shimomura's greatest musical accomplishment, creator of the Guile theme from Street Fighter 2.
Yep.
Oh, hell yeah.
So,
it's incredible. Her range is amazing. And I was saying before we started recording, I think Super Mario RPG is sort of buoyant as kind of cheesy as you might think it is at first. You sink into it and it fits the world so well, it fits the game so well, and then you look at it and you hold it up against her other work like Street Fighter 2, but then you hold it up against Final Fantasy 15 and you see how kind of broad reaching and how much depth her work has. She did Kingdom Hearts, Legend of Mana, Legend of Mana and Super Mario RPG and Street Fighter and Final Fantasy 15, they don't sound anything alike. Whereas you have other composers I love, but their work sounds of a single creator, whereas Shimomura could just and can do anything, and it's remarkable.
I think the thing about Shimomura,
I think she credits Super Mario RPG as the turning point in her career as well. So I think that this game really kind of helped get her on a trajectory to make all of those amazing soundtracks as well.
Yeah,
which she might not have had in the the arcade fighter universe if she kind of just stayed there.
I think she has she does have a very, very wide range of styles that she can do. But I do think that she has a couple telltale signs of a Yoko Shimomura soundtrack or a piece, right? Because all of them do, right? We've been talking about since we just did FF13, we've been talking about Masashi Hamauzu.
It's that's a Hamauzu bit.
We can hear when that's a very Hamauzu thing, or that's a very Nobuo thing, right? And I think that Yoko Shimomura, she's a little more lyrical maybe in her melodies. They're very pop leads focused, I think, a lot of times, where I can hear Nobuo Uematsu's stuff and hear a lot of progressive rock and romanticism, European romanticism in his music. And Yoko Shimomura's, I hear a lot of love for very consonant sounds and very I don't want I feel like sometimes saying something is pop is kind of putting it down, but that's not really what I mean. I mean she clearly enjoys rock and roll, pop music, even some Irish music that's very consonant, that's very fun to sing along to. Because a lot of the pieces, especially in Super Mario RPG, they're very fun, they're very playful, and even when they're not, there's a lead line. There's almost always a lead line. And I think in her later work for things like Final Fantasy 15, where games have gotten more cinematic in the kind of music that they are, right?
More traditional scores.
You can still hear leads in them, which is very rare, I feel in scores, right? So I love FF15's Demons is a great song or whatever. It's very Super Mario RPG. It's very bouncy, bunts, 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 bunts. And then it has a very sing-alongable piece.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of Danny Elfman in some of that regards, where it's
almost so.
The breakfast machine from Pee-wee.
yeah. And so I think that Super Mario RPG is the perfect Yoko Shimomura experience, because it kind of like, out of all the things that I've heard from her, from the
just her
the
cover
Street
letter.
Fighter 2 yeah from like the Street Fighter 2 stuff, from the later like Final Fantasy 15 things, I feel like this is very much like the nexus of like, oh, this game was made so that Yoko Shimomura could make a soundtrack. Like, only she could have made this soundtrack, and it's fucking perfect. Like, it's so good.
I think soundtracks are, I mean, obviously I'm biased since we all kind of have music backgrounds. I'm sure Curtis and Alex would probably agree as well. But like, soundtracks are such an important thing, because you could have a game that doesn't have that strong of a soundtrack and it can still be a good game. But I think you could probably have like a bad game that has an incredible soundtrack, and that would be enough to like make it.
It's called Mystic Quest.
It seems like it's to me at least that it makes it like worth kind of playing or having an emotional connection to a game. It's so important, and I think she really nailed it with this soundtrack, because there's just so many, like, every song on it is incredibly good.
The battle theme, which pretty much never changes, which is
but also never gets old.
Also, but there's like the boss theme, which is kind of has like this kind of like kind of twangy, like kind of like kind of boogie.
You haven't gotten to the
boogie.
Final boss, right, Alex? Yet?
No.
Oh my goodness! When you get to the final boss, what she does with the boss theme in the final boss is so fucking brilliant. It's so good. It's like permanently etched in my brain. It's like, that's how you start a final boss music. Like, that's just what you have to do now, because Yoko Shimomura did it that way, and it was right. And it's like, it's perfect forever. Wait, there was something I wanted to say too. Oh yeah, Mario is a series that's known for like, it's like level 1 music, or it's like various pieces of it are iconic every time, right? Like, it constantly reinvents itself with new main themes. Like, everybody knows about the later Mario games with the ba ba, like, right? It's like become it's become a piece of like video game musical history, and that's a very big weight for somebody to have to operate under and be like, no, it needs to be as classic as like Koji Kondo themes, right? And I think she nails it, right? Like, even the like running around in the first area, you know, like, it's like such a good tune.
It's really interesting too, kind of just thinking back to, like, we're obviously watching this with hindsight, but just reading through Aidan's book has really made me kind of think about things in ways I don't usually, because you know, you put these developers and these composers and these people in the industry on such a high pedestal that they deserve to be on. But at the time of all of this, you know, it's way earlier in their careers. So like, yes, Koji Kondo was kind of becoming like a legendary name amongst video games at the time, with his work on Zelda and with his work on Mario, and like to the point where like everyone knew the Mario theme, including my mom, who like never played a video game in her life but would constantly sing along to the songs because she heard me and my brothers playing it. But like it like, not to say she didn't do an amazing job taking his music and stuff, but it's so funny that we're just like, oh yeah, like being handed a Koji Kondo piece and having to like put it in a different game and stuff, like, which she did incredibly. But at the same time, I'm also kind of like, yeah, Koji Kondo just took a Deep Purple song and put it in Zelda, and that became one of the biggest like musical like recognizable songs in video games.
It took a T-Square's Sister Marion and was like, that's the Mario theme. Dun 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 dun.
But no, it's so interesting and cool.
The one thing that, like, whenever I look at like these musicians, the thing that, like, over the course of writing my book, and not just musicians, but particularly them, was how young they all were. Like, Shimomura was 27 probably when they were making Super Mario RPG.
God, what have I done with my life?
I wasn't really accomplishing much when I was 27. You know, you look at other composers like Mitsuda was like 22 when he did Chrono Trigger or something like that. He was in his like early 20s, and it's like, it is kind of remarkable that you had, like, you know, someone like Koji Kondo working in the 80s doing the Super Mario stuff, but then you have, you know, somebody who's still fairly young early in her career who was taking, you know, like what somebody else, another young composer, created, and like, they were still laying the foundation of expectations for this kind of stuff, right? Like, still trying to figure out, like, okay, what does a video game soundtrack sound like? What does, you know, a Japanese RPG soundtrack sound like? And like, you know, taking that on in your 20s is like really exciting, and like, I think you have to have a lot of confidence in yourself to be able to do that, right? and they did it so well. Like, you look back at that time and you're like, oh yeah, like, that was Shimomura working at, like sort of the height of her talents, or like her peak. But like then she went on to create, she's created 25 years more of amazing music because she was so young at the time.
Still going. Speaking of which, to bring everything all back around, most recent full composition is the newest Mario and Rabbids game. So,
oh man, I'll have to listen to
alongside Grant Kirkhope.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Curtis, I sent you a spreadsheet in the Discord. I found there's this giant crowdsourced spreadsheet in my book, which has hardware like synth sources for like all these like VGM that people have been reverse engineering.
Oh snap!
And I sent some screenshots because it's just too big for me to like open. So you have a sound canvas, right? So you might be. I think it is the baritone sax patch from the sound canvas.
Oh, okay, I do have a sound canvas too.
So yeah, you can probably use that in your own compositions now.
Delightful. Oh, I have a 55.
New
It's on
Zaku
the
song
88.
coming out. Let's get that.
No, I don't have it. I don't have the 88. No, I have the 55.
Yeah. Oh, the hubris.
My hubris. Now I'll never be able to recreate Booster's theme.
Anyone have any favorite songs from the soundtrack that they want to bring up? There's so many good ones. It's so hard to choose. Like obviously Booster's Tower we've been talking about constantly, but
what's the mini game theme, like when you pop out the sewers at the beginning,
that's a really good one. Yeah,
that's so good.
They're all so good.
I only like the, what is it called? I think it is Fight Against an Armed Boss.
That's so good. Yeah. Oh, you know what? I do have one that I really love, and I would even go so far as to say did a good job at defining my musical tastes as a young person. Because like,
oh wow,
I mean, I know a lot of you. I know my podcast host through music, right? And I have been very, very much into like prog and like weird stuff and experimental for a long time. And one of the earliest like proggy experimental 15/8 songs, like time signature songs, is the Weapons Factory at the end. That's like an industrial, odd, off kilter song that like it begins very. It doesn't seem like it has a repeating point, or it seems like it's just weird sounds until the synths on it come in, and it just becomes incredible. Such a good song. So that one's a fantastic song. People should go listen to that one. It holds up today.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff. I love this. I have no idea if the chip enhanced, like, because I don't know enough about like the capabilities of the Super Nintendo in terms of sound. Because it's like a lot of samples, right?
Sample based.
It had a bunch of samples. It also weirdly had built-in reverb. Like,
yes, I was going to say that.
Our friends at Retro Game Audio, they had a really amazing episode of, I think, just about the Super Nintendo in general, but they sourced the intro, the iconic intro of Chrono Trigger with the pendulum swinging and the ticking.
Yeah,
they sourced that, and then were able to disable the reverb on it, so they had it kind of played side by side. Where you just hear the ticking, and you're like, oh, that's weird, and then you hear it as you would on a Super Nintendo, and it's very, very interesting.
That is very interesting, actually. I would like to hear that.
Yeah, is it definitely
that reverb? I like when the reverb's still going between transitions between scenes. Sometimes it kind of makes nice little crossfade between instead of just like hard cuts.
Yo, crossfade was in this game. They wrote a song for this.
What about you, Aidan? What's your favorite song from this game?
I'm sort of with Alex a little bit. Like, I feel like it works so well as an entire soundtrack, and like it's just so comprehensive that it doesn't rely on specific songs for me to like really kind of come through and be effective. Like, like there are some Japanese RPGs and video games where like there's one or two songs. Like if you're looking at Final Fantasy VI, like I think of Terra's theme. Away. Like immediately, right? I think of the spaghetti western twang of Shadow's theme. Like those character themes like do so much emotional lifting in that game. Chrono Trigger's soundtrack is fabulous, top to bottom. But there are games that I like really get taken like back to a specific scene. If you ask me about the music in Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG, it's just like it just the music is so organically connected with the world that exists there, and it gives so much. It works in concert so well with the events and the graphics and the world design that I don't feel like it relies on single songs. Like I don't think of a single, like everyone that you guys have mentioned, as soon as, you know, I think about it, I can hum the melody, and it's so easy to kind of get stuck in your head as an earworm, but it doesn't have like standout tracks for me in that same way, because I think it's just like
it's just all hits.
It's
all
the
hits.
It's all hits. Yeah, it's like it's bangers all the way down.
To you, it's picking your favorite child.
It's Fleetwood Mac rumors, where it might as well just be a greatest hits album.
Yes, exactly. And like, you know, not all of them, you know, like some of them are more memorable than others for sure, but like they all do their job so well. Yeah. And I don't think it relied necessarily on having to have that one, like, you know, specific leitmotif that it keeps coming back to remind you, like, oh, this is an important part of the game, you better be paying attention. Yeah, sure. Like a lot of Japanese RPGs. So I think that's also why I respect Shimomura's work on it so much, is that, like, you know, she didn't just, you know, nail 4 or 5 like real, you know, solid songs and then build sort of like some fluff around that. It's just like top to bottom, it just works and does what it needs to.
This is a little bit secondary to music. It's involved with the music, but I was actually thinking about it this last playthrough, that one of my favorite areas now, and I never cared about it before because no like plot actually happens in it, but when you go through like the Star Mountains, what is that called in the south?
Yeah.
Do you remember the name of that area?
Is that the Star Road?
No, the Star Road's the one in the heavens, right?
I think so, yeah.
Or is it the Star Road? There's like, I think it might be called the Star Pass in English. I don't remember, but I have to find it now because the story's not going to make sense unless I know it. I'm sorry. Sorry, future Alex. Cut some time out.
It's not the one where you have to like hit the flowers and then open up the like.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the Star Road, isn't it? Star Hill. Okay, running up that hill.
Wait, is it Star Hill? Yeah, Star Hill. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Anyway, what was I saying? So Star Hill is one of my favorites now because it comes directly after one of the most bombastic sets, which is the booster events, right? Like the booster events and then the events in Marymore. That is all incredibly fun, very Looney Tunes, very bombastic, very silly. And if you don't know how to fight the cake, it can be very difficult. And then it kind of chills out for just a moment. This is like exactly the halfway point in the game. Like if you like draw a line down on the map from Bowser's Castle, this is halfway through like your journey around the world. And it works as like this intermission. And I think like the music really hit me this time for being like, oh my, this is like the one chilled out one and the one more emotive piece in the game. And it reminded me because you were talking about like associating emotions with different areas in video games. And I was like, I never really appreciated how this pause, this intermission in the game, to just walk around this very like quiet world and talk to the inner thoughts of the denizens of the world and like how they think about things and what they wish for. It's like super important.
Yeah.
And like, it really hit me hard. It hit me hard this time playing through. I was like, that's perfect.
It makes me think of is, you know, Final Fantasy VII, something very similar happens. After the Aerith and Sephiroth stuff.
You go snowboarding. Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's this like this apex moment where the whole emotional crux of the entire game happens, right? And you're riding high, and then it kind of goes for what you're talking about. Is, you know, like you go back and you're at Icicle Inn. And it's supposed to be this sort of quiet moment of reflection, I think. Yeah. But instead, you just start snowboarding, and it's always struck me as like so absurd that this hugely huge event happens. It's hugely emotional, and then like 10 minutes later, I'm like playing this bad snowboarding game. Whereas I think what you're describing works so much more because it does connect you with the emotions of the game world, right? Like it does put you into that place where you're stopping to think about the people who populate this world and why you're on that quest, why you're trying to save them. And it is, you know, it is quiet. It has really twinkly music.
It does.
Mm-hmm. That's not very like, you know, not very overbearing. Like so much of the music in the game is very overbearing. It's like, you know, it's fast paced. It's very like melody driven, whereas the music there isn't. And it is that quiet moment of reflection. And Final Fantasy VII, I think, tries to do something similar, but just like just feels weird because it doesn't deal with sort of the emotion of what's going on. It shows you that Cloud's damaged, but not necessarily about like what's actually happening.
Right.
The game obviously gets into that more later on, but once you hit the slopes, like just after your girlfriend
once
died,
you hit the slopes, the only thing that
and,
matters is backflips, baby.
Yeah, exactly.
Shredding
In those
the gnar.
balloons. Yeah. Damn, sucks for Aerith.
Yeah, exactly. And Boosters, the stuff at Boosters Castle isn't the same, but it is a big moment in the game, right? It is halfway through, and it does sort of like transition you into the back half of the game that becomes more Final Fantasy-ish.
It does.
I feel like the second half.
I was thinking about that because like
less of a Mario game.
Yeah, because the latter half of the game, like the couple stories that you get into are like about deceit and politics and shit. Like just, I mean, casually so, you know what I mean? It's still Mario.
It's still Mario. Yeah.
It's cloud politics. It's fine.
Can't believe they made Mario political.
Yeah. Also, Valentina's name in Japanese is Margarita. I thought that was very fun as I was playing through it. I was like, hey.
There's a lot of like I think the localization team and the translation team did a really, really good job, but there are a couple of things here and there that are just kind of like funny little quirks, like
it's quirky,
her being like Margarita and then Valentina, like not really. I feel like at one point I knew why that kind of change happened, but an interesting one is Punchello. Originally Punchello, if you don't remember, is like he's in the part where you're in the mines and there's a bunch of bob-ombs and stuff. It's after a bunch of bob-omb fights, and the translator, I think his name was Ted Woosley, wanted to call him James Bomb.
Bomb.
They were like, no, you're not calling him James Bomb, and he's like, okay. Instead, it was Punchello, and his line when he introduces himself, he says, like, the name's Ello, Punchello or something. Like he does the James Bond line, and it makes no sense in context. In a similar way, where when you're in like the last dungeon, when you fight Magic Koopa or like Kamek, depending on I guess whatever. And with Malo, you can actually like read the enemy's mind and get a little bit of insight into them, which can be used for really good effect in this game. And the translation is so weird because in the Japanese version, he's kind of just saying like, oh, that guy kind of looks like that baby with the mustache that I used to chase around, like an obvious reference to Yoshi's Island with Baby Mario. But in the English, you read his mind and he just says, is this ... my child? And you're like, what? That's completely different, like in all respects. That
interesting.
Like, it's so funny.
The Ted Woolsey like Square Enix translation era is so fascinating to me because I feel like, he did Final Fantasy VI, he did Chrono Trigger, he did Super Mario RPG, and they have just such a strange sense of humor, all three of them. That comes in through the translation. And I think all of the games themselves have their own brand of humor, right? And you can see that in the Japanese version of Kamek's Thoughts, and obviously the whole game is Super Mario RPG. But Woolsey just like he took a really challenging situation and had the freedom to sort of like have fun with it in a way that then got lost. You look at like Super Mario RPG and like its localization's pretty good, right? Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI were pretty good, and then of course we get into that awkward period where Square and Nintendo break up and Square moves over to the PlayStation, and like the localizations got pretty bad. Final Fantasy VII is really bad, right? Like you have stuff like Suikoden and Suikoden 2, which were not good, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. I just wrote a piece for the Washington Post about like that era and how people like Richard Honeywood and Alex O. Smith, who did like games like Vagrant Story and Chrono Cross, like how they sort of rebuilt the idea of what Japanese localization could be. But Ted Woolsey was there, like, doing this work and doing, pretty valiant, pretty decent games localizations in the 90s with like really poor tools. Like Richard and Alex were talking about like way back in, working on a game like Final Fantasy VIII, and like, they had flat text files, no context, and then like a VCR. And that's like how they would like replay, parts of a game. They'd have to like find the VHS, rewind to that part, and then, like watch it again.
I heard
and that's how they could get context and stuff like that. It was wild back then.
I heard a story in regard to Final Fantasy VIII that they actually didn't have any kind of text from Square Enix. So what they had to do was they only had like the game, and I could be completely wrong about this. I forget where I heard it, but they had to use a Game Shark to then rip all of the dialogue themselves so that they could then start translating it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I can't remember if Richard talked about that specifically, but he like some of the stuff he described to me about that time was just bananas. Like, and like no real support from like the development staff, or the Japanese, like creators and stuff. He was working in Japan, working at like at those offices, but still like very little access to the original creators or like the game assets or anything like that. So it was like absolutely using stuff like Game Sharks just to get access to stuff in the game. And that's why, was it the scope changing? Was it timelines? Was Super Mario RPG just given a little bit more breath because they were sort of targeting and hoping to break out into the West with it? So, they gave maybe Woolsey better resources because at the end of the day, like everybody I talk to about localization always comes back to saying like a bad localization in a game was never the fault of the talent or the skill of the localizers.
Yeah, sure.
Like the people who worked on, Suikoden 2 has an infamously bad localization. But like if you look at it, it was localized by like Jeremy Blaustein, who worked on Metal Gear Solid, which has like one of the best like localizations, not just of that era, but like, like in context, like one of the best localizations ever, in my opinion. And like, Jeremy Blaustein is incredibly talented, right?
It feels like an American product.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, as it should, because of, the connotations of what Kojima was writing about. But like, these are very talented people, but like the resources that they had at that time were not great. And for Woolsey and like a small team of localizers and translators to take a game like Super Mario RPG that's like, relies so heavily on humor and like actually nail that to the point where like it still makes me laugh now. Like there's genuinely funny writing in there, and the writing that's not humorous does the job, right? Like it's fairly simple, it's straightforward, it never stumbles over itself, except the some of the jokes that maybe were lost in translation because of Nintendo being uncomfortable with certain things. Otherwise, it's like, for Woolsey to pull off what he did, I think is really impressive. And like, I don't know what happened between the end of the Super Nintendo and the beginning of the PlayStation, but a lot changed and it took a lot of effort to get things back on track.
It's interesting too, with like localization. I always think of Nob Ogasawara, who localized Pokemon Red and Green for Nintendo, and just the stories. Like I listened to a podcast, I'm blanking on the title of it, where he was just talking about that era and how wild it was and how limited resources they had, where it was, like you were saying, it was just kind of a flat text file of just everything, and it just had like variable 1, variable 2, variable 3, variable 4, and then he had to like read a nonsense, like almost like a Mad Lib sentence and be like, okay, well, I need to kind of figure out in the context of what I know about this game, this probably means something like Pikachu used this attack and this Pokemon had this status effect. And there was like some really interesting things. I can't remember the specific one, but there was like a status effect that like it became really difficult to localize just when they introduced double battles because of just grammar and like using a plural versus a, and like it like haunted him because the way that it had to be localized for the like Game Boy Advance games were like really clunky, and like people kind of gave him a hard time for it. And he's like, I tried so many other different things, but they said text limitations with obviously the Japanese alphabet can fit a lot more with a lot less characters.
You can do an entire group worth of people in Japanese by adding one character, the Tachi. So like if you wanted to like talk about all 4 of us on the podcast right now, you could just be like Alex Tachi, and they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, that's Alex and his gang that he's hanging out with right now. Yeah, perfect. And
like for context too, like if I remember correctly, Nob was like a games writer or journalist or something, just covering the Pokemon games, and there was a big gap between the Japanese releases and the Western releases, and so like I'm pretty sure Nintendo just liked his games writing, his games journalism about Pokemon, and so they like hired him to do the localization. And so like that's sort of the context that like we were working with at this point, which is wild.
It's really funny too because they kind of really were hard on him with his translations. They were like, no, you can't do that. Like there's a moment in Pokemon where you can trade for a Spearow, and when you trade someone in the game, they have a nickname on their Pokemon. So he wanted to call it Brittany as like a clever pun on Britney Spears,
yes,
Britney
yes.
Spearo, and they were like, absolutely not, you cannot do that. So I forget what he named it and whatever. And then when they didn't actually want to localize it and like retranslate everything for the European market, but I think it was like the French translator or the German translator, I can't remember which, pointed out that like one of the Pokemon's names, if it was just Charmander and stuff, like the phonetic translate or like the way that it translated made it sound like piece of shit or something strange like that. So they were like, we have to, okay, you can localize it. And at that point they like didn't care. So he just got away with like a bunch of stuff and like making really funny like puns and taking it less seriously than Nob had to. And it's very, very interesting how, you know, it kind of changes between translations.
It evolved so much, like just like, and I think like as the genre in those games like Final Fantasy and Pokemon in particular like blew up and started becoming really successful, like the developers and the Japanese publishers were all of a sudden saying like, oh, okay, like this isn't just, we're not just creating games for Japanese players and like any success in the West is sort of like a you know, cherry on top. It's like
a happy accident.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we now have to like install processes that create high-end products for Western fans as well. And I think that, you know, that led to some of what you're describing as well, that it was like, no, you know what, like you have to take this seriously. This isn't just a byproduct of like, you know, releasing a game in the West. It's part of the creative process. And eventually, like, you know, you got to a point where, you know, Richard Honeywood and Yuji Horii were like, you know, like talking through things like during the creative process and creating the games. Like Honeywood is part of the reason why Dragon Quest got voice acting, for instance, right? So like you had localizers who were in, you know, the creative process, right, you know, down during the development period, instead of just sort of like a secondary thought after the fact. And as we're getting, you know, we're at a place now where games are mostly being released worldwide. Like it's very rare nowadays for a game to, you know, come out in Japan and then be released in the West way later. But back in the day, like you'd have to wait months or years to get a game. And so that created a situation where, you know, the developers were, by the time Pokemon Red and Blue were coming out here, the, you know, Game Freak was working on Gold and Silver. You know, like they didn't really care that much about Blue and Red. So I'm sure that challenge for Nob working on that was like, you know, like how do you convince people who are knee deep in the next game to care about the 2-year-old version?
I did see Super Mario RPG had a very short difference between the Japanese and North American release. It's like 2 months. That's crazy.
Yeah, which was very rare at the time. Yeah.
Well, with the N64 coming out, I think.
They were trying to just churn that out. I think especially it's not that surprising with this, given that it was like the reason that this game exists was, hey, let's have an RPG that's going to do well in the Western market to kind of introduce, you know, a kind of like a flagship RPG that can then open up the doors for all of our other RPGs.
I like the idea that like they release a game on the Super Nintendo to be like, okay, this will make people get the N64. And then young me is like, wow, Square's great. I'm going to get a PlayStation so I can play their other games.
Well, it's wild, right? It's wild that we went from Super Mario RPG, like this huge collaboration between these heavyweights, you know, and then also on the Super Nintendo, we were seeing Square and Enix collaborate on Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
Enix wasn't like officially involved, but, you know, Horii and lots of, you know, there's lots of crossover at Dragon Quest. We were seeing these collaborations where it felt like it was this real like coming together, like symbiotic kind of, you know, moment for the genre. And you have a Mario RPG made by Square, like that's incredible. And then all of a sudden, like not that long after, the next year, like there was this huge public breakup between Square and Nintendo. You know, it was like, I joked on Twitter that it was like, you know, the Banshees of Inisherin is basically just like a, you know, like the biography of Square and Nintendo breaking up. It was like, it was really gross. It was really brutal. And then all of a sudden it's like you did nurture and try to introduce so many players to the genre on the Super Nintendo, and the Super Nintendo was known as like the Japanese RPG place, and then all of a sudden the Nintendo 64 hits and it's just like
there's like none.
That's just gone.
Quest 64, baby.
So wild.
Yeah.
Quest 64, Ogre Battle 64 was good.
Ogre Battle 64. Yeah.
Paper Mario was good. You know, there, you know, there was no quantity, but there were a couple of gems. But like, you know, going from Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 6, like, you know, Earthbound, Super Mario RPG to Quest 64 Ogre Battle, and,
especially in comparison to
Paper Mario
any JRPG on PlayStation. Like, just take your pick. Like, there's so many.
Yeah, and it would, like Nintendo just sort of missed that boat, and there was a lot of hubris there. Like like Nintendo sort of like dug their own grave in that situation, by just pushing at the wrong time. Like they didn't, I don't think they were taking Sony too seriously, because they hadn't really had to, right? It is what it is. They kind of came back together, and I feel like they really flourished again on the handhelds during that like transition to the HD era. Like I feel like handheld like Square and Nintendo environment was really strong again once they started.
I mean, the DS still is like one of the greatest things ever released. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I think about it sometimes too, because like I feel like because of the N64 era, Nintendo is sometimes still not known as an RPG, like a JRPG company. But like when I actually get around to thinking about it, I'm like, all mainline Shin Tenseis are Nintendo handheld properties now, right? Like like especially Atlas was just like, oh, Nintendo wants RPGs, pow 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 pow. Here's like, just a ton of them.
It's almost like when you were sort of introduced to the genre, right? Like for me, like any Japanese RPG, like I'll pretty much just buy on my Switch, right? Even if it's out on PS4 or PS5 or whatever, because like to me, just playing Japanese RPGs on a Nintendo console feels right. Like that just feels like the place that they should be played. But I was getting into the genre during the heyday of the golden age on the Super NES, right? Whereas, if you were coming into it a few years later than I was in the, the 90s, or you started with Final Fantasy X, it's like, no, Japanese RPGs, like that's a Sony thing, right? And then like the PSP was great for Japanese RPGs. Like, you can associate that genre with somewhere else and just like, look at Nintendo and Japanese RPGs and be like, yeah, okay, I guess like, they're there, but that brand association is really strong.
So I feel like that is a pretty good primer, not only on JRPGs, or actually, let me say that again. Alex, cut all that out.
Leave it all in.
So I feel like that's not only a pretty good primer on Super Mario RPG as a game, but a lot of like the era's JRPGs in general that we kind of got to today, which is great. And Aidan, I want to thank you a whole bunch for coming on to the podcast today. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your book that you've written? Tell us about it. Give us the pitch.
I mean, you kind of already did that, but
yeah. So I talked about it a bit earlier, but like the pitch is basically like, so Fight Magic Items. It's the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. So it's the history of Japanese RPGs and the people who created them, but it's also the history of and the story of the people who played them. Like I wanted to really parlay the experience and the feelings and the emotions that I had growing up in the 90s and the 2000s. Being a teenager when this genre that was so like emotionally driven, that really emphasized story was going from this little niche thing to something that everybody at school was talking about. And so the book is, I didn't want it to feel like a really long Wikipedia entry, right? And so it takes stories about people, it takes stories about the games, it ties all of that together into an experience that hopefully shows like why impressionable Western gamers were so excited to find this genre on the Nintendo, on the Super Nintendo, on the PlayStation. And what happened when we started transitioning to the HD era and the genre started to struggle a lot? Why did that happen? Why did people stick around with the genre? And then what does the future look like as, the people who grew up loving the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation Japanese RPGs? Like, what's happening now that they're making new games? What's happening now that people like Hironobu Sakaguchi are kind of winding down to the end of their career and inspiring the next generation of creators? It's full of games. It's, it revolves in and around the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest franchises, but I tried to get as much in there and as much context, as much history and as many stories as I could. And so it touches on Phantasy Star and Suikoden and Lunar. It touches on, later chapters talk about Nier and Persona and Fire Emblem, like all of those games that have come into sort of like the Western gaming zeitgeist, looking at how they fit into the puzzle of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest original creation and success and what the future of genre looks like. So it's chock full of games and stories and people. And I had a ton of fun writing it, and people seem to be enjoying it as they're reading it. So It's been so much fun coming on to talk about Super Mario RPG, because it was one of those games that like I would have loved to have written like, chapters and chapters and chapters about, because it symbolized so much of what we talked about today, like that collaborative moment between Square and Nintendo, like everything that Square and Nintendo were for the 8-bit and the 16-bit genre or eras, and how that all fell apart and what that means. Like I could have dug in and written chapters about all of that. And then how Nintendo sort of took over the Mario RPG franchise and created Mario and Luigi and Paper Mario, and then how Paper Mario has become its own weird thing, and Mario and Luigi has become its own weird thing, and then they had crossover games, and like, how different that is than what, Square originally created. But, there's also a lot of the DNA of future Mario RPGs in Super Mario RPG, which is interesting. So, being able to like just unfold a lot of the ideas that I had been thinking about in the book that didn't make it in there has been a blast today. And we've been, like looking for an opportunity to chat on the podcast for a while now. So I'm so happy it's about this game, because I could talk about it forever.
I love it. It's this does feel like the kind of perfect intersection of like as you were talking about, because it is like right in this like peak of like JRPG peaks, but also this kind of weird like kind of nebulous crossover between different like parts of the video game industry. It's really cool.
Is Five Magic Items available everywhere? Where would I go to see that?
Yeah. So it was published in October 2022 by Running Press, which is an imprint of Hachette. You can get it anywhere you can get books. So it's like online retailers. When people ask, I try to push them towards like their local indie bookstores. You can go in there. If they don't have a copy on the shelf, they can order it in.
Support local bookstores. They can order you anything.
Yeah, support local bookstores. They need the help, and it's a great place to buy any book, and they can order it in. And what I say is, like if you can support local, and this goes for game stores and stuff as well, but if you go in there and you order a book and you say, hey, can you get me a copy of Fight Magic Items? Sometimes they'll order in a couple extras, and so that can be a good way to support authors. And you get into local game stores to order games in and stuff like that, especially from like indie game creators. Like, that's a way to create support for the people that put out work that you enjoy. So supporting local has all those benefits of supporting local business, but also the creators that you're enjoying.
Yeah, it's extremely.
And then
important.
Online you can find me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter.
You're on Twitter. I'm so sorry.
I know.
Who's amongst us isn't on that hell site too much?
No, gosh. Yeah. But it helped us connect, so it's not too bad.
True. Yeah,
right?
Exactly. There's a lot of good there in the worst website ever.
It has it has potential. It has like its pockets of really wonderful stuff amongst all
like you were saying
stuff.
with like supporting local, like Twitter's a very good thing for like local musicians, local artists, local just anyone in the creative field. So that's why like seeing the trajectory that is currently on is so heartbreaking, because for like like me and other people, we could be like, oh whatever, that website sucks anyway, but it's like, no, like I have so many friends who are freelance artists or freelance writers or what have you, and it's like, oh, that's a huge pillar of communication that makes it all of us kind of be able to meet and talk, and to see it being run so poorly is such a shame. But
if we're JRPGs, it's very much in its N64 era, right at the moment. But awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you again so much. Yeah, this has been a hoot.
But yeah, you're a dribble of ink on Twitter, right?
Yeah, a dribble of ink on Twitter. So ADRIBBLEOFINK.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Highly recommended follow. Definitely check out the book. It's been amazing reading. Even with my ADHD brain that could never focus on anything, I've had no problem like opening it up and just blazing through and reading an entire chapter and being like, I want to keep reading. It's so good.
It's been my substitute for doom scrolling before bed, so I don't like.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, it's the opposite of doom scrolling. I feel like it's a pretty positive book. Lots of heart in there. And I did write it specifically like each chapter sort of stands on its own. And so it's perfect for somebody who wants to, like you can blaze through it. You can find out like the whole history of Japanese RPGs there in a chunk. You can flip through it. You can find your favorite games. You can look back on moments and find something in there that, like appeals to you, or, it's good for, looking back and learning more about your favorite game as much as it is like a whole like narrative about the genre. So I'm glad you guys are liking it.
I appreciate the little like windows, like just kind of like you feature like just a game, like kind of as an aside, like, hey, here's this game that came out, like that's relevant to this chapter.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot.
Even your footnotes, I've been really enjoying too.
Yeah. The footnote, like half the reason I wrote the book is to write footnotes. I was
going to compliment you on your footnotes. I was going to say I'm a very big fan of the footnotes. They're very good.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the book.
I wish this podcast could have footnotes.
Yeah, footnotes are great. But yeah, the call out. So like throughout the book, whenever I've mentioned a game that doesn't necessarily get its own like whole deep dive, and it could be anything from like Beyond the Beyond to whatever, like games that are sort of like these really kind of niche specific games to broader games. Some of them get a little cutout sidebar, and it explains who worked on the game, why is it sort of interesting, or what's a fun fact about it. And that was just a way to like call attention to how broad and diverse just Japanese RPGs were, and there's about 50 of them in the book. And then some games get a really big cutout at the end of a chapter as well to really kind of put a highlight on those, because there was no way to fit everything in the book. Every story, every Japanese RPG, and the framing device for the whole book is like, this was my journey through Japanese RPGs, right? This is what I experienced, what I saw. But I think even if for people who didn't play the same games as me, I think we all experienced the same things, right? And the same feelings as we were kind of becoming fans of video games and playing games with our friends, or experiencing new stories, or new challenges, or overcoming things in a game that have been hard for us. And I tried to put all of that in there. And there could be another version of the book out there that somebody else wrote that covers in-depth games that I've never really played or didn't really cross paths with. And Japanese RPGs are so broad that those experiences, I think, are universal.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job with that. So I never had a Super Nintendo when I was growing up as a kid, so I came to RPGs pretty late in my life. And I still reading kind of the anecdotes that you had about just playing these games for the first time and discovering new games and talking about it with people. Still hit the same exact like emotional chord with me, thinking back to playing games with my brothers and with my friends in school and talking about it and stuff. So it was really a joy to read.
Yeah, I find that like, Japanese RPGs, they're like, ostensibly they're like a single player game, right? They're supposed to be these things that you experience on your own, whereas like stuff like fighting games or GoldenEye or Super Mario Kart, like were like social experiences. But for me, like Japanese RPGs were very social.
Very much, yeah.
And I think that like that was something that my friends talked about that brought us together, that made us really strong friends in high school. And so like, I know that lots of people have that experience, and they might, like your friend group might have been playing GoldenEye late into the night, right? And that's what you guys were talking about. But like that feeling of like bonding and coming together closely over a game is something that I think is really powerful and extends out beyond gaming. It's music, it's books, it's movies, it's sports. And those kind of universal human stories are so fun to tell. And the book is, I hope it's on those notes for people. I tried to find a lot of those universal experiences from creators and fans alike.
You illustrating like the Square as kind of this group of just, to me, it seems like these kind of, I almost imagine what kind of as like prog punk hippies, because they're just like a bunch of guys who like love music, and like Nobu is like listening to like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and wants to be a wrestler and shit like that. And this other girl and the sprite artist who's like, she was just an illustrator. She didn't sound like she really had too much of a resume, and like this is like a little kind of like misfits coming together. Like, okay, we got to make something. Like we got to pitch to the boss that we have something here.
Yeah, I think cool. It was like one of the stories in the book. I think it was Sakaguchi. I'm kind of blanking on who it was, but they worked part-time at Square while going to college, but then also like managing like an internet or like a computer like bar.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that.
Like where people could come and rent computer time. And the whole idea there was that like they were running this to basically find like the biggest nerds they could at the school and then offer. Yeah, they were scouting. Yeah, which is like can you imagine that?
Crazy.
Like nowadays, like with the way that gaming has gone?
It's hard to say like obviously like I feel like for an average individual or for like me, right? I'd like to like believe that if I was like of a college age in the mid to late 80s, I'd be like, oh, I'd be working on one of these games. But surely I wouldn't be. I'd be much too lazy or whatever. But there is like this like nostalgic appeal to that era of development and how I don't know, ruddy it was, I guess. Like how like just kind of messy putting together projects like that were, and it's very romantic now, which I'm sure at the time it was probably a giant pain in the ass, but like there is like a romanticism about it, and like I try not to be nostalgic, like too nostalgic, because I'm like, that's brain poison. Don't let that control you. But
it's all like it's all messy now, right? Like people who make big games will tell you that it's all like, it's a miracle it holds together, right? But now it's driven by like quarterly profits.
Right.
And that changes everything compared to where, like these people were playing, like working with what they were working with in the 80s, like you talk about Kazuko Shibuya, the artist who like created Final Fantasy's look and feel, right? Like back then she was just working to create, like what was interesting within the technical limitations. Now there's, there's so much more that goes into it. But I think the burgeoning indie scene has sort of revitalized a lot of what made the 80s really interesting. Yeah. And so we talked about Chained Echoes earlier today, and it's, like a Japanese RPG created basically by one person. And it's a 40-hour JRPG, beautiful pixel art, like polished top to bottom. And I'm like, okay, like that's really interesting because you can see one person sort of driven, or it's like a small group of people really driven to create something that's like really personal to them. And it doesn't have to sell 12 million copies,
right.
To become successful. Like, there's so many, like how many copies does Final Fantasy 16 have to sell to be successful? 20 million? Like, if they don't sell 20 million copies like Elden Ring, they're going to be disappointed. Like Final Fantasy 6 sold like 400,000, right? And so like, I think the indie space is really interesting in that regard, that, you can have this development environment that's not driven by corporate profits, by investor returns, stuff like that. But anyway, that's all in the book. You can read all about the past and the future of Japanese RPGs and fight magic items.
I believe I will.
Yeah, everyone should. It's been an absolute joy to read. So
thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
I guess I'll do some mini credits.
Yeah. Go ahead. Alex, would you like to throw us into Barrel Volcano, where our soul will be set aflame?
Sure.
Can't wait to check out those hot springs.
That's right.
I guess thank you to Yoko Shimomura for this game music.
Oh, yeah.
With some credits to Nobuo Uematsu and Koji Kondo. I found some scans of like a signed copy of the soundtrack, and there's like a beautiful headshot of her and like a nice little like a cool like story from her, like her experience working on this, including like an English like thank you at the end of it, which says, "Thanks, Mom and Dad, my brother, friends, and loved ones," and so on and so forth. It's really sweet. Looks great. But yeah, be sure to check out Aidan's book in the show notes. I'll have that everywhere. As we said, we've all been enjoying it. Theme music, I'm probably going to use this version of Fight Against an Armed Boss by this Chilean band Luda Patas. They describe themselves as VGM music on fire from Chile.
Nice.
Love it.
This is really cool. It's a complete bop. Go support them. It is Friday, and so it will be probably Bandcamp Friday? No, it'll be 1 week after. Either way, go see them in the show
notes. Go back
notes.
in the past and get it on Bandcamp Friday.
Go check it out. There's like really cool fire music in there. But yeah, leave us a review and rate us on iTunes, Spotify. You can call us at 530-MATERIA. I did not have, should be get like 530 Bomb or something like that.
Bomb, yeah.
And yeah, you can find us at Every FNF on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and hop in our Discord. And I don't have a quote because Mario doesn't talk.
it's a
we
me.
just pantomime the ending of it.
Mushroom. Just drop a Chris Pratt like sound
Mushroom Kingdom, here we come. Stomping
Koopas.
So bad, dude.
But yeah, we'll see y'all next week.
Oh, bye.
Bye.